You want something to prove that they existed, and for Frank, to some extent, that is the life insurance policies. Seems really weird because it's such a sort of mundane thing at some level. Life insurance policy, the sort of thing that people sell you in the Two Ronnies. You know, people sell you life insurance because they're dull people from Hendon in cocktail parties, and yet for Frank Bright, it seems to me that those two life insurance policies that he feels he knows existed are symbolic of the fact that his parents existed and their existence was wiped out.
Frank's anger was directed at this organisation ICHIC and the big European insurance companies that funded it. But it turns out that ICHIC was not the first fund set up to restitute Holocaust victims or their descendants. Back in the 90s, lawyers in America represented thousands of Jewish families who claimed they had money in Switzerland, locked up in bank accounts that they hadn't been able to touch since the war ended.
And so this is the trial team, and in these years I was an ACLU lawyer.
That, I think, is Kurt Vonnegut, isn't
Yeah,
it?
Kurt Vonnegut was the largest...
Bert Neuburn was one of the lawyers who started to make life difficult for the notoriously secretive Swiss bankers.
If a Holocaust survivor approached a Swiss bank after the war, or their children, and said, "We believe that there was an account here that is essentially ours," what would their response have been at that time?
Well, if a family approached the banks and said, "We think we have an account, we're pretty sure we have an account, we don't know what the number is," by and large, the reaction was, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do for you unless you have more specific information." And they turned them away, and they turned them away in very large numbers.
Bert and other lawyers began to apply pressure on the Swiss. Amid terrible publicity about Switzerland's role during the war, the banks finally agreed to make a settlement in 1998. It was agreed that $1.25 billion would be paid out for all claims against Switzerland. 800 million of that would go to the claimants of dormant bank accounts.
How close is that figure of 800 million to the amount of money that you think was in Swiss bank accounts at the start of the war?
I think it's about a fifth.
Right.
Our experts, our forensic economists told us about 5 billion in accounts.
5 billion?
5 billion, about 5 billion. So 800 million is about 20%.
Okay.
But if I went into a court, I couldn't prove this.
If Bert Neuburn's figures are correct, where, in that case, is the other 80%? No one knows. Thousands of the bank accounts belonging to Holocaust victims were closed soon after their countries fell under Nazi control, and there is no record of who took that money. It's simply gone from the books. So I wondered if Bert was happy with the 800 million the banks have handed over.
There's a legendary comment I made where I said, it's a symbolic amount. And they said, boy, you must come from rich parents if you think it's a symbolic amount. I said, no, it's a symbolic amount relatively, but it is high enough to be a meaningful statement of responsibility.
Yes,
I said, if it was less than that, I wouldn't touch it. I said, what I want is I want to disgorge as much as possible from them so that they don't get to keep their ill-gotten gains, and to have it be done in a way that publicly creates memory. The best compensation we can give is the compensation of memory.
It seemed to me that Bert Neuburn was comfortable that Holocaust victims got the best deal possible out of the Swiss banks, and that story has reached some kind of closure. But then I started to think about Frank Bright and his battle with the insurance companies. He certainly hadn't got any satisfaction from ICHIC and the fund they set up. I decided to pay a visit to Al Lewis. Al was senator of the state of New York for 12 years. He was also an arbitrator of claims for ICHIC, which closed down earlier this year, having paid out some $300 million. I wanted to know how, in his mind, this $300 million matched up to the actual worth of Holocaust-era insurance policies.
An economist estimated the value was 15 billion American dollars. You compare that to the $300 million. Those figures should speak for themselves.
Yes, well that's the thing, because a vast amount of people must have been expecting to get awards that tallied more closely with what they felt their policies were worth.
Yes, if 15 billion is correct, it's unfair, it's a rip-off, And that's why I wish I never, ever heard of iCheck. I never got into this. It haunts me. It haunts me. Because it's wrong. That's $1 billion theft of people who aren't even represented. We don't even know them. It has a stench that's greater than the stench that came out of the crematoriums. It's a stench made up of greed and almost criminality. I don't know if they'll let this go into your TV program, but that's a fact, in my way of thinking.
Al Lewis obviously felt incredibly strongly about it, but I wondered if the real fault lies not with iCheck, but with the insurance companies, who after all had let this issue hang for 60 years.
Something that has happened here that we're discovering is we're sort of poking away at the incompatibility of life insurance and genocide. And that's, I think, the kind of overarching answer as to why these companies haven't paid out for so long. It's because the one thing that they thought wasn't going to happen when they set their companies up was that millions of the people who had their claims were going to be killed.
One thing that was becoming clear to me was how successful the Nazi policy of dehumanisation still is. Because even with my own family's experience, it was still coming as a shock to remember that these alien figures behind barbed wire that we're so used to seeing were people with stuff, houses, insurance policies, bank accounts, ordinary possessions that they treasured. Some of the most valuable of these possessions were hanging on their walls. Art represents an enormous and difficult part of the battle for restitution. So much so that here in London there is actually an organisation called the Commission for Looted Art that helps return art stolen by the Nazis to its rightful owners. One of the directors is Anne Webber.
Could you in general say how much art was lost during the Holocaust or during the period of Nazi regime?
I suppose that one of the estimates has been that, that something like 1/3 of all the world's art treasures were stolen by the Nazis, and 1/5 of all the art in private collections was stolen by them in that period, 1933 to 1945, and that the art that is still missing is worth between $10 and $30 billion.
At the end of the war, Allied soldiers found huge caches of stolen art. Some of it was returned to its original owners. Much of the rest ended up in museums around the world, where it remains to this day. But, extraordinarily, most of the museums haven't even checked to see what stolen art they might have in their collections.
So if we were to name and shame, as it were, which countries have been particularly good at identifying looted art and restituting it, and which countries have been particularly bad?
In terms of identification, the countries that have been particularly good, ironically, are the countries that weren't part of occupied Europe. So, for example, Britain has been excellent, the United States has been very good, Australia has been very good, Canada has been very good. The countries in occupied Europe who may well have looted works of art there, little research has been done on works of art in their public collections.
Right, so they haven't even begun the process of identification on any large scale?
Absolutely not. And of course the country where one would have expected the most to be done, because it will certainly have the most looted art in its public collections, is Germany. Out of the 618, I think it is, German art museums, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction has actually done the work and published their research.
It's clearly a massive ongoing problem. And yet even here, I wasn't sure that simply finding this art and giving it back is the right answer. My radar was twitching again.
I sometimes think that what confuses people about this is that they have a simple idea, perhaps, we have, of good and bad, which is Nazis are bad, but museums, good. And somehow or other it is then confusing to think that, well, obviously it was bad these paintings were stolen, but surely it is good that they're in a museum.
In the ideal world, that would be the case. The museums would be in a completely separate arena. But if you look at the history of Nazi Germany, the collaboration of the museums, the art world, the art directors, the art historians, and so on, with the Nazis was absolutely central to what the Nazis achieved. And the museums in Germany and Austria were absolutely part and parcel of it.
Although the morality of restitution is complex, I felt some of my questions were being answered. And with that, I was starting to feel a bit more open to the idea of pursuing a claim for what my family had lost. Then, on my travels, I had an unexpected visit from my younger brother, Dan.
No, this is some other one.
How would you feel about the idea that we could actually apply, as it were, to get major damages? Because it was a whole brick factory, a number of houses. If we were to try and get that back, we'd be looking at, you know, a couple of million.
Of course, so anyone's life, a couple of million is going to make a distinct difference. I mean, I can stop selling small business loans. Well,
yeah, that's what Dan does at the moment. He sells small business loans.
In all over the country.
We've only just started doing that, though.
Yeah.
I think if suddenly there was an opportunity for us to pursue a claim for what Ottino has actually lost, I think we should pursue it. Don't you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain part of it.
Obviously, you can have most of it.
Well, thanks.
That's what I'm thinking.
Just don't tell the tax.
Because I don't want you selling loans to whatever it is. I don't want you cold calling.
I'm not cold calling.
I know you're not cold calling. They're all hot leads.
What, do you need a business loan? Do you need a business loan?
Don't cold call to the television.
Anyone needed a business loan, give a call.
Getting fired up about recovering the family fortune is one thing, but the truth remains that the task is always incredibly complicated. It depends, for a start, on where your particular portion of the missing billions has ended up. Every country has a different take on restitution, and there's one country where it has hardly even begun. Poland was the epicenter of the Holocaust. More Jews died there than anywhere else in Nazi-dominated Europe. Jewish life was almost completely eradicated and their material wealth devoured by the Germans. To this day, few that survived or their heirs have received a penny for what they lost. Morris Tabaksman is one of those people.
Hello. Hello, David.
Hello, Morris.
Do come in.
Before the war, Morris left Warsaw to study abroad. Almost his entire family were killed in the Holocaust. It was another 20 years before Morris returned to Poland. Whilst he was there, he was shown buildings built and owned by his father.
You've got photos, haven't you?
Yeah.
Can we see the photos?
I took photos of them.
So, what did you think of the properties when you saw them?
They were huge, they were big, I was impressed.
Yeah.
And more importantly, the buildings were still registered in his family's name. So Morris chanced his arm and went to the Ministry of the Interior to ask for them back.
And I said, look, I've come here to claim my property. And he said, oh no, we can't give you anything. So what we can do is we can give you an apartment, if you like, for life. I thought to myself, well, better than nothing. On one condition. I said, that is what? You will live here, in the apartment we give you.
You had to live there?
Yeah.
Okay, so you were offered the chance of living in communist
Poland
in the 60s.
Yes, and get a free apartment.
And get a free apartment.
So
and you thought
I didn't have to think.
And you thought swinging London was back at home.
I imagined so.
So you didn't even think about it?
When communism fell, I and others started getting active in trying to reclaim.
Despite the fact the properties are still registered in his family's name, and despite the fall of communism, they are still under the control of the local council, and Morris has had no joy in getting the properties back, or getting any compensation for them.
It's the principle, it's the justice which I'm after, not the money. Under every right, every human right, a son is entitled to inherit from his parents. And my father worked very hard and very long hours in order to achieve what he did.
There was really only one place to go after talking to Morris: Warsaw. I wanted to see what he was fighting for myself. I was on my way to Wola, the neighbourhood where Morris's properties still are, to meet Marek Stalmaszak, one of Poland's leading estate agents.
It's definitely this building here.